Hello, this is Dr. Darty, and today we're talking about muscles. Muscles are a really interesting, really daunting topic, both in their physiology and in their names, because there are so many of them. Fortunately, for this class, you won't need to learn them all. In fact, for most classes, you don't need to learn them all unless you're taking gross anatomy in medical school. Depending, however, on your career path, you may need to know quite a few of them. You massage therapists obviously need to know some, my EMTs, my phlebotomists, all my nursing students. Anyone going into any health career is going to have to know quite a few. Physical therapists for sure. So we're going to talk about some of the high spots in muscle terminology today. Not all of them, but a few of them. Your book does a good job. I've also given you a couple of video resources that you might find interesting. But let's just get started. Let me start by writing something. Maybe one of the most useful things you can learn today. And that's when you see this as any part of a word, myo. That's a big hint that you're dealing with something in muscle world. So let me give you another word that uses that element. You know, your book gets very technical about what's the root and what's the suffix. I think I'd rather just call them all elements, sort of like Legos for words. And if I show you this word, I'll bet that you now can figure out what we're talking about. What part of the heart do you think is the myocardium? What layer? It's the muscle layer, because myo means muscle and cardio means heart, so the myocardium must be the muscle of the heart. And you're right. Let's get even fancier. You've already learned so much more than you realize you have, I guarantee you. What do you think is wrong with someone who has this dread condition? Myocarditis. Doesn't sound very good, does it? Itis we know means inflammation, and we know cardi means heart, and myo means muscle. So that must be an inflammation of the heart muscle, typically caused by a virus, but other things can cause it too. But myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle, is something you really don't want to have, but you will meet people who have that condition. Let's try a couple more just to help you feel more comfortable with the terminology. What do you think it would mean? I'll leave my friend myo up there if I wrote this term. Myositis. That must mean that a muscle is inflamed, and you'd be right. What if I made it even fancier by writing the name see what a big word that is? Polymyositis. What does poly mean? Well, a polygon has many sides. Polymorphic means many shapes. So we think probably poly means many, and itis means inflamed, and myo means muscle. So polymyositis means a condition in which many muscles are inflamed, and that's exactly right. So there are a lot of other examples we could list. The myometrium is the muscular layer of the uterus. Anytime you hear myo, that means we're in muscle land. So the terminology moves on pretty much from there. A generalized term, see if you can figure out what this one means. I bet you can. Sure wish I could see you folks. Myopathy. What does that mean? It means something's wrong with the muscle. Pathy is like pathologist. It means an abnormal condition, an abnormality. So myopathy is something wrong with the muscle. And there are different kinds of myopathies. So that should give you some grounding in using terms related to muscles. There are lots of others. Later on, we'll use, I'll call your attention to some words that can be pronounced differently depending on how you learned it, where you're from, but that'll get us started. There's a really nice, in one of the videos that I have listed as you don't have to watch it, but if you're interested, I try to curate these very carefully. But types of muscle, there are basically three types of muscle. The type we usually are thinking of when we talk about muscle is our skeletal, or sometimes called voluntary muscles. These are the muscles associated with being able to do what I just did, shrug your shoulders, for me to be able to speak to you, for me to close my eyes tightly, turn my head from right to left. Those are all skeletal or voluntary muscle. Voluntary is not entirely accurate. It means that you have at least some control over it, not necessarily total control. What does that mean? Well, your diaphragm, the main muscle of breathing, the big dome-shaped muscle that separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. When we take a deep breath, our diaphragm contracts and moves down, makes our thoracic cavity bigger, and our lungs expand. So I can hold my breath for a little while, but not forever. I think the world record holder for breath holding is something like 17 minutes. I haven't looked it up in the last few weeks, but that's extraordinary. Most of us, after just a few seconds, feel a real urge to return to involuntary breathing. And of course, you don't have to think about every breath you take, because that would leave you very little time for thinking about anything else, like learning these terms. The other thing is your eyes blink, and you can try not to blink. Everybody's had stare down contests, or if you go to the ophthalmologist, then they have that little puffer machine that measures the pressure inside your eyeball, and you think, don't blink, don't blink. I'm a notorious blinker in photographs, and so I think, don't blink, but you're going to blink eventually. So not all voluntary muscles are totally voluntary. They look different under the microscope. They are striped and they have long fibers. Wish I had a microscope to show you, because it's really fun to look at muscle fibers. All right, the second kind of muscle is cardiac muscle, and it's found only in the heart. And as you would expect, it's involuntary. You do not have to think about making your heart beat from one moment to the next. Again, that would be quite a burden, because you couldn't think of anything else if you wanted to stay alive. So your heart muscles are automatic. They too have stripes, but they're shorter and branched. They don't look just like skeletal muscle, but they're first cousins. The last kind, the unsung heroes of your body, are smooth, or sometimes called visceral muscles, and they're everywhere. You just don't think about them very much. You don't have to. Another handy thing not to have to worry about. They line the walls of all your arteries and your veins, and thereby regulate your blood pressure, the blood flow to different areas in your body. They form part of the tube that is your alimentary canal, your digestive tube that moves food from the back of your mouth all the way to the other end, and that goes on without your having to think about it. That action, by the way, is called peristalsis. I bet you know that word. The adjective is peristaltic. So peristalsis, if you've seen a snake swallow, say, a mouse, peristalsis. I'm such a bad speller. Peristalsis. That's the term for the squeezing action of smooth muscle, obviously found in your digestive tract, also in your urinary tract. The urine that's made in your kidneys doesn't get to your bladder just by dripping like in a Mr. Coffee machine. It's actually squeezed down with that same boa constrictor-like action that pushes things along. So your involuntary or smooth muscle or visceral muscle is really important to keeping you alive. There are a lot of things that go on that, thank goodness, we don't have to worry about. So those are the three types of muscles. Learning exactly how muscles work is so fascinating, and it's beyond the scope of this class, but I thought I'd mention to you there are two proteins that interact to make a muscle contract, called actin and myosin, and that only works if your body has sufficient calcium. There are other associated proteins in the process. But you remember we talked last time about how your skeleton isn't just a framework for the rest of your body to hang on, but it is a repository, a credit union for calcium. Well, the calcium that your body has to have, one reason it has to have it is your muscles won't work without it. And as you know, if your muscles aren't working, then you won't breathe and you'll be dead. So, calcium important to muscles. Now, let's talk a little bit about the names of not all 600 and some muscles, just a few muscles that we want to get know the names of and the locations of at this point in our careers. And again, depending on what your final destination career-wise is, you may have to learn lots and lots of them, or you may only need to learn a few, but it's nice to know. In my experience, the students who have some of the most difficulty knowing the names of the muscles are those who know them by their nicknames or slang terms. I'm talking about you, my gym rats. For those of us who like fitness activities, then we hear around the gym or in fitness classes all the time people referring to muscles by their familiar names. So let's start with two or three that healthcare workers need to know because it's where injections are given. So you should really know where those muscles are. You probably know these already. One is the deltoid muscle. It's called deltoid because it's shaped like a triangle. The Greek letter delta is also a triangle. So it's sort of an inverted triangle, and it forms the shoulder pad of your shoulder here, the area between your shoulder and your upper extremity here. So your deltoids are on each side, and in the gym we tend to call them delts, and we do delt raises to try and make them prettier, stronger. So you can see what they do if you think about it. When a deltoid muscle contracts, depending on which set move, they can move your arms forward or out to the sides in particular. A lot of injections are given in a particular part of the deltoid muscle. So you have anterior, middle, and posterior deltoid muscles. If you've been watching the news where they show every night someone getting a COVID vaccination, you've seen an injection into a deltoid muscle. Another place where injections are given, and we all dread those, are the ones giving in your posterior, in your fanny. And those are given into another muscle that people know by its nickname, your glutes. And we're talking gluteus maximus, one on each cheek back there. And there is also a gluteus medius and a gluteus minimus, but they're deeper. We don't see them from the surface. One common mistake you will see when people give injections is they're to be given in the upper outer quadrant of the gluteus maximus, because that way you're not going to hit the glorious sciatic nerve that runs a little more medially. Sometimes people don't really pay close enough attention to their landmarks, and they catch that nerve with devastating sometimes effects for the person receiving the injection, because if that nerve's damaged, it can be very painful and can impair the function of their entire lower extremity. Usually happens because someone's trying to preserve someone's modesty, and instead of making sure they see enough territory to know for sure they're in the upper outer quadrant, they just sort of guesstimate and just pull clothing down a little bit. I don't like to see that done. So gluteus maximus, another site for intramuscular injections. The last one is of special interest to this retired pediatrician because I've seen mistakes made so many times. The muscles of the anterior thigh that make up the bulk of the anterior thigh are called quadriceps femoris, and it's 4 distinct muscles. The one that runs right down the top of your thigh is called rectus femoris. A little tip, by the way. If you're having trouble spelling muscle names correctly, I have found that it helps to exaggerate their suffix because, again, those tricky Latin rules. So, for example, rectus femoris, if I were trying to learn to spell it and remember my US's from my IS's, I would say rectus femoris. And that helps me. You don't say it like that when you talk to other people, but in your own mind, say rectus femoris, and you'll spell it correctly. You just have to memorize those. So that is big, has a lot of surface area, but it's really a fairly thin, shallow muscle. So if you read carefully directions for giving injections to preschool children, it's actually to be given in one of the other 3 muscles of the lower extremity, and they all start with vastus. Vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius, and vastus medialis. Now, which one do you think is lateralis? We learned that last time, right? Or in chapter 2, that lateral means toward the outside of the body, away from the midline. And that's where the injection, if you read carefully on the package insert, is to be given. Why? Because it is the biggest, has the most mass. Even in a pre-walker, there's a lot of muscle mass there in a little child. I have seen too many times someone take that syringe and needle and plunge it into the rectus femoris, leaving a big old knot because there's really not very much muscle there to absorb the injection. So watch that if you are the person giving injections, and that's why you want to know which of the quadriceps femoris you're injecting something into. Make sure it's the vastus lateralis. All right, moving on for some other ones that are good to know. Again, for my gym friends, everybody knows your biceps, or the guns, as they say. They're like the worst kind of friend. Do you have any friends who show off and talk about how much they're doing and really someone else is doing the work? I hope you have no one in your group like that. Well, the biceps is a very handsome muscle, and it is one of the muscles that bend the elbow. But most of the work is actually being done by the muscle behind the biceps called the brachialis. Sometimes pronounced brachialis, but I like brachialis better. So the brachialis underneath the biceps is really, if you will, the wind beneath its wings. It is doing most of the work of flexing or bending the elbow. A helpful mnemonic to remember which muscles bend the elbow is there's 3 B's that bend the elbow, and they are biceps brachii, that's the real name for biceps, the brachialis, and the brachioradialis. The brachioradialis forms the fleshy part of your forearm. If you make a fist, you can kind of make him stand up there. So that is the brachioradialis. He sits right over the radius, and that's part of how he gets his name. So those are 3 B's that bend the elbow. On the other side, the back, if you will, the posterior or dorsal surface of your arm, you have triceps brachii. Again, gym people tend to just say triceps. We're doing triceps extensions, not my favorite. But the whole name is triceps brachii. And that extends, we'll get into flexion and extension in just a minute, at the elbow. Let's see, latissimus dorsi. Again, you know, we love that machine at the gym, the lat pull down machine, and we talk about swimmers having really nice lats. If you've watched the Olympics, they really do have spectacular. But the whole name of the muscle is latissimus dorsi or dorsi, depending on who's pronouncing it. The abdominal muscles, we tend to say the abs. There's actually several layers. The one that provides the six-pack, if you're lucky enough to have them, is rectus abdominis. Another good place to practice saying rectus abdominis, and you'll spell it right. We talked about the quadriceps femoris already with its 4 components. That's why it's called quadriceps. It has 4 heads. On the other side of the thigh, on the dorsal or posterior surface, we have the hamstrings. Their real names are semitendinosus and semimembranosus. I don't expect you to learn those. And you even hear people in the business, so to speak, often just refer to them collectively as the hamstrings. The gastrocnemius is the big muscle in your calf. It's the one that helps you take off at a sprint. It's assisted when you're simply standing by a muscle underneath called the soleus that is more for just maintaining your posture when you're standing up. And we could go on and on. There's so many great muscles to talk about. A favorite of mine is orbicularis, or let you pucker up, or orbicularis oculi, let you scrunch your eyes. If you break down really hard, you'll feel that big old masseter, your crocodile or alligator muscle there that closes your lower jaw forcefully. They're really fun to learn, but you don't need to learn them all for this class. But at some point, depending on your specialty, you may need to know quite a few. All right, let's see. There's a couple of other landmarks that are sort of associated with the musculoskeletal system that I know quite a few of you are going to need to know. One, my phlebotomy students, you already know those, is your antecubital fossa. That's this little place right here where we often draw blood, this inside, if you will, of the elbow. It's actually the ventral or anterior surface. Remember the anatomic position of your elbow right here. And I'm not going to stand up and show it to you, but on the back side of your knee, that is called the popliteal fossa. And it's important that we check that. When someone's had a leg injury, we want to make sure that their pulse can be felt in the popliteal fossa there. Now, the fun part of muscles is learning the names of different muscle movements. We're not going to learn them all, but we're going to learn some real basic ones here. And I brought my friend along with me. We'll work together to try and show you those. The most obvious one is flexion and extension. So flexion, I brought one of my weights here with me. So flexion is when we move it closer to the origin of the body. The easiest way for me to help students remember flexion and extension is picture rolling yourself up into the tightest ball in the fetal position. When you do that, virtually every major joint is flexed. Extension means you go back to the anatomic position, and if you extend even further beyond that, I'll give you an example in just a minute, that's hyperextension. So if I take my friend here, and he's not as flexible, he needs to go to yoga. But if I wanted to do flexion of his elbow, I would bend it. It's about as far as he will bend without breaking. And to extend it, he would straighten it back out into the anatomic position. Turn around here, honey. Let's go on this side. You can see better. With his knee, if he rolled up in a ball, you can see that he would bend his knee, and that's flexion. If he straightened it back out to the anatomic position, that's extension. He can't he can a little bit. He can hyperextend his knee just a little. So that's, at his trunk, if he flexes it like he's going to roll up into a ball, he's flexed, and then he's extended. With his neck, I'm not sure what his neck will do. Not much. I can do my neck. My neck is flexed, it's extended, but if I look up at the ceiling, it's hyperextended. Now the trickiest one, and the one that always gave my students the most trouble with this flexion extension business, is the shoulder. And I get why that is. Because if I hold my hand out to you, I say I'm extending the hand of fellowship. I'm extending my hand. But actually, can you see that at the shoulder when I do that, it's the same as when I'm rolling up? So although we say we're extending our hand, we really aren't. At the shoulder, we are flexing. So that's flexion. Extension is back in the normal anatomic position. And hyperextension is if we reach behind us, like we're going to dive into the water. So those are basics for flexion and extension. That's pretty intuitive. The only tricky one is at the shoulder. Okay, then we have abduction and adduction. Why do people make things that mean the opposite sound so much the same? They should have made them sound very different, but I'll write those two words because they're very important. What happens when a person is abducted? Child abduction, obviously a bad thing. They are taken away from where they should have been, right? So most students find it easier to grasp abduction first. Abduction means to move away from the midline of the body. So come here and help me again, honey. Here we go. I like him better on this side. Okay, so let's say we're going to abduct his upper extremity at the shoulder. We would do it like this because it's moving away from the midline of the body. Hold that pose for me, please. Now, what happens if I want to move it back toward the midline of the body? One letter different. That was a bad plan, wasn't it? Whoever thought of that? It's those Romans. They're responsible for all that. So the opposite of abduction is adduction. Well, where does that come from? Well, if you think about, if you're celebrate the season before Christmas, which we call Advent in some traditions, or if you think of the advent of a new age, vent in Latin means to come, veni vidi vici in Latin, they say B's like W's. But ad or ad means to go towards. So the advent is moving towards something, moving to it, if you will. So the opposite of abduction is adduction. We're moving it toward the midline. He can do it with his hip too, probably better than I can. Can you pull your leg out? Yeah, there I'm abducting at the hip, and now I'm adducting. So abduction is out, away from the midline of the body. Adduction is coming back toward the midline of the body. And it's most commonly used for shoulder and hip, I would say, is where you'll hear that most often. Easier, thank goodness, to keep in mind and to understand is rotation. Quite a few parts of our body can actually be rotated about a central axis. So I can look from right to left, that's rotation. Owls do it even better. I can rotate my trunk to some degree. So several of our parts of our body, we can use our muscles to rotate, and that means exactly what you think it would mean. The last one is the one that probably gave my students most problem of it all, and I don't think they talk about it a lot in your book, but I felt I'd be remiss not to mention it when we're talking about movements. It may come up later, and that's pronation and supination. Pronation and supination are especially used when we talk about our forearm, that we can do this. Really a handy, bad pun, thing to be able to do. Think about it. If you can't move your wrist, it would be hard to brush your teeth, to open a door, to do anything in the kitchen pretty much. So this is a really nifty thing to be able to do. My corgi said if she had opposable thumbs and the ability to rotate her forepaws in this way, she can turn them a little bit, not as much as me. She'd rule the household. She does anyway. So how are we going to remember the difference in pronation and supination? I'm going to show you one that I've known forever. Supination means that I could hand you a bowl of soup. So I brought a soup bowl from the kitchen just to show you that. When my forearm is supinated, I can hold a bowl of soup. Pronation is the opposite. Another mnemonic is that when you're in supination, your palm faces the sun, and when you're pronated, it faces the plants. That's for gardening enthusiasts. I just always remember I can hold a bowl of soup when I'm supinated. The other way is pronated. So that may help you remember that somewhere along the line. I'm trying to think if there's any other particular thing I wanted to cover. I think that's about it. If you have questions, as always, please email me, kdougherty0003@kctcs.edu, or contribute to the class's general discussion board. Thanks for listening. I hope you liked it. Bye.